I'm not sure I really understand your question. The examples I've seen from, say, a guidance counselor, are, an example would be the amount of students who are referred to the office, to his or her office. And so this particular educators decided to implement a program to help students who are having behavioral issues. And that program runs for a certain amount of time, and the educator collects the data on whether or not those students' referrals go down.
Oh, so it's really about the teacher that whose class they're coming out of, not so much about the...
No, it would be the program that guidance counselor put into place,
Okay.
and the effectiveness.
But in a more dynamic situation, using the school or maybe people that would have interest in this. I'm not sure particularly what teachers might have interest in it, but if a teacher decided that, you know, you're talking about doing teamwork and working together, maybe some students or students didn't have very good skills in teaming or some other social skills, listening skills. Would that be something that a teacher could choose, or is it specifically for just guidance counselors and school psychologists?
I would strongly suggest to the teacher that they choose their content area for their district determined measure, because the district determined measure must be linked to their standards, their academic goals.
Even if it was a third one rather than just two? Okay.
I would still, no, I mean, they need to be tied to the curriculum and to the content standards.
Okay, thank you.
And Sharon, if a teacher had some concerns, in any of our buildings, they would go to the guidance counselor or the school psychologist and look for help and support in the social emotional domain, you know, using standardized tools or screenings or checklists.
Right.
So,
I guess I'm just saying as an individual, not particularly a school committee member,
yeah.
that's something I'd like to see schools concentrate on more. I know we're getting rammed with everything about academics, so I don't know if there's time to do that.
Well, we use, you know, we teach pro-social skills through curriculums like Second Step. You know, those type of, and the classroom teachers use those measures. And, you know, we keep data based on those type of curriculum materials. So those things will be continued to be used.
Thanks.
Any other questions for Dr. Blanchard? I've got a couple that kind of overlaps my colleagues, and they're really just to bring me up knowledge base. First, tremendous matrix and the challenge staff and the leader teams have to create this in a real life situation, and still the train is moving while you're doing it. You mentioned that the Teacher Association has asked for a portion of an additional data gathering year. A couple of questions to flow out of that. Roughly, we have X number of prime evaluators in our administrative teams. What would, I'm understanding in previous years I can recall, there was a staggered, if you had an excellent teacher, it could be on a 3-year cycle. Now it looks like it's a 2-year cycle. And is the cycle starting all staff the same year? Or are they?
No, we stagger.
So a prime evaluator might have 15 to 1. What would be a ratio?
It's actually larger than that. I think that in the middle school, I think the evaluators have about 30.
Yep.
And at the high school here, it's more than that.
Yeah, so that's a challenge in of itself, because as the staff within a year gathers their individual measures, in addition to a departmental agreed to, there may be a curriculum-based, a third, and a fourth, and a fifth. The prime evaluator at some point would sit with that person and sift through the quality of that person's ideas and say, great, or gee, I think you should suggest that you have this. So there's that portion that it still has to be measured, how those evaluators get to have that all done?
Well, the process of picking the DDM, the district determined measure, is really generated from the teacher groups. They're the ones who identify those measures and then sit down with their evaluator and you know, I mean, the district will come up with a listing of all of the district determined measures that have been identified. And those measures, we've already done a preliminary submission to the state that came out of the task forces. Now, we will get very specific and you know, let the state know exactly what they will be. So that takes the burden off of the evaluator as far as that process goes. There still will be that end of the year discussion around the evidence.
Okay.
Yeah.
The goal setting would be a lot easier if there's already a formula there stated by our group that, yes, I'm selecting these measures. The parameter said, yes, that looks good. Good luck, and then they meet.
Yeah, and to that, you know, in addition, we're really encouraging teachers during that goal-setting process to tie in the district determined measure to a goal, especially in the elementary school where teachers tend to create team goals.
A follow-up question, and maybe Joan could answer, and it kind of touches what Sharon said, and again, another challenge. The majority of SPED services in our district might be inclusion, they might not. I don't know what the ratio is, but we'll have inclusion seems to be a movement throughout the Commonwealth, which is a good thing. I wonder how would that SPED inclusion teacher, working with our mainstream regular ed math teacher in 4th grade, create her or his own measures that, to me, would have to be within the inclusion, not a pullout, married to the math teacher that he or she is working with.
Yes and no. They're still
Go with the yes one
responsible-
first.
They're still responsible for IEP progress monitoring of IEP goals and objectives for those students. So their focus, it doesn't matter what setting it is, it's the goals and objectives that were developed from an IEP. They're still responsible for that. And it doesn't matter necessarily where the setting is, because it's an individualized approach. So I think that and IEP goals and objectives may be one of the district determined measures that SPED teachers will be looking at. That can be a consideration for DDMs. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. And obviously,
good
the
point,
goals and
yeah.
objectives are also tied to the standards also. So even if students are below grade level standards, we still are responsible for looking at the grade level standards.
And just like inclusion, although that SPED teacher, when she reviews and brings to heart the child's IEP goals, he also has to make certain she's cognizant of the math teacher's
That's right.
goals. Otherwise, why have the inclusion be also a mixed message going on during the 50 minutes?
That's right.
So there is a challenge for the SPED teachers to make certain that happens with their
Yes.
X number of kids in the room.
And they're still assessed at the grade level with MCAS or PAR.
Right. Yeah.
And when you look at the impact rating, remember, you still have that determination of what you deem as low, moderate, or high. And so there was an example given in a workshop where if, Joan hits me with her car and I have to have surgery, and then she hits, somebody much younger than I am, and that person has to have surgery. The goal is for both of us to rehab and get ourselves back to our normal physical state, but it might take me longer because of my age than it would a younger person. So that's how you start to look at that impact, that low, moderate, or high. The goal is the same, but
My last question, and you partially answered it. How might a staff member be judged at the end of the year in a summative to be proficient, but have a low category when it comes to the measure of slide number 4? How would that happen?
That's a good question. And not having been through the process, I would imagine that it's a possibility that the classroom instructional practice and the practice of that teacher and the way in which that teacher manages the class and the level of activities and engagement is high, but perhaps the rigor and the ability of the students to be able to move and grow in that particular area would be low. I think you're getting at a little bit of the reason for this rating.
And that's why you'll notice that people in that zone on that chart are on a one-year directed growth plan that, rather than saying everything's fine, we should continue this along for another year.
It's not as easy, normally you would think if someone were judged proficient, they would at least have a moderate engagement with the youngsters on that lower horizontal versus the other, but first blush, I'm just trying to understand myself, and complicated and challenging compared to 4 or 5 years ago, and so we all have our jobs cut out for us.
I decided that it would be important to have Carla do a little presentation like this, because she did essentially the same presentation to the staff, both at the elementary level and middle and high school level a week ago, and ultimately how this plays out is part of the collective bargaining agreement between the teaching staff and the committee. So I thought it would be a nice, useful thing to educate everyone on something that is complicated.
And I'm just kind of thinking about what you just asked, Terry, and this may be a pretty dramatic example, but for some of the students we serve with issues related to safety, and one of our primary things is teaching them to be safe. That in student learning, that might be a really high impact, and the teacher may get proficient or exemplary in that area, but some of the other skills are less prioritized, so they may have a lower impact in that child's program. Does that make sense? I mean, that's a pretty dramatic example of being safe, staying safe, which those are some of the priorities. Those are the primary priorities for some of our students, whereas some of the other skills have a lower impact on their student learning. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
As a former teacher, I'd want to avoid low.
Yeah.
Even if the low is determined by my 25 kids in the class. So that's a human nature issue, is how do I balance that happening?
But you could have a teacher that could be either exemplary or proficient in the impact on that student, for that student. The impact could be low in some areas that you're teaching, but high in other areas, and they could receive ratings of exemplary or proficient.
Any other comments, questions for Carla or Joan? Thank you, Dr. Blanchard.
There will be a test.
I thought
At
you were
least
going to
two.
say that.
We will measure the growth.
I don't know who's next.
We're going to move on to F, subcommittee reports, finance, facilities, and use fees.
We had presented at the last school committee meeting recommended fees to put in place that address the use of the new school and also use of the facilities at our elementary schools and middle schools and the turf fields and grass fields, and we're looking to get approval or tweaking to said fee structure.
To my colleagues, any reflections on 2 weeks ago discussion regarding the user fees?
I move that we accept the facility use fee schedule as presented.
Do I hear
I
a second?
that.
Second, discussion? All those in favor of voting to approve the use of the scale? Aye. All those opposed? Thank you, it's unanimous. Second item is fingerprinting policy.
The fingerprinting policy we presented to you last meeting, it is the literally verbatim fingerprinting policy that has been recommended by the Massachusetts Association of School Committees and has been uploaded to the DSEU website as the model. The only thing that we did was clarify in the second paragraph on the first page of what was presented how this would play out and what the timeline would be for Monomoy based on the timeline that state law is dictating, but also felt it was important to be clear that that this fingerprinting does not extend to all volunteers within the building or within our school buildings. It is really limited to volunteers that chaperone overnight trips or would have unmonitored contact with students, which is consistent with where it seems most school committees are going. I want to emphasize that just because we wouldn't fingerprint, all the volunteers that would be coming to the school would still be subject to the Corey process. This is just an added layer to the Corey process. And again, it's that delicate balance, that added layer. Fingerprinting isn't cheap, or it is a $35 fee that gets passed on to the volunteer, and it's more for staff, or for teachers or licensed staff.
We need a motion to approve this policy. Steve? Ed? A second?
Second.
Any further discussion?
Just
Brian?
Just briefly, I mean, I know that this is something that we're being compelled to do, and I appreciate the fact that this is, one advantage we have in this particular proposal is that it is one that apparently is likely to be adopted throughout the Commonwealth, which gives us some, some basis of comfort in it. I've expressed before, it's kind of a double-edged sword. You create a situation where you determine who has to be fingerprinted and who doesn't have to be fingerprinted, and then at some point when something happens involving someone who under the policy did not have to be fingerprinted, then of course we'll all be judged by why didn't that person be included in the policy. But I understand that we have to draw the line somewhere, and as I said, I think it does give me some, I'm happy to hear that there are other communities adopting, or school committees adopting the same thing. The other concern I have is the effect on the pool of volunteers we'll get if they know they have to put out the money for the fingerprint test, and who knows where that'll end up being if they have to go to take it. I mean, I know that they were, at one point it was being done here, but I imagine that's not the case anymore, or it won't be in the long term.
It's about to end
Yeah.
here. We've donated space, or granted space to have on-site fingerprinting, but at some point in the next couple days, we'll be closing up shop, and people will have to go seek other places. That you can go online and see all the different locations available in the state, but it's the Cape, and the locations are few and far between.
I mean, we have to have a policy. As long as we all recognize it's a starting point, and if we have to, we can amend the policy as needed. Even if it gets to the point where we have to come up with funding, which I'm not proposing tonight, but defray the cost in some manner if it adversely affects the pool. And I imagine we'll be told somewhere along the line if it does adversely affect their ability to get volunteers. So You know, having said all that, I'll certainly vote in favor of it, but I just think it's important to keep all those facts and factors in mind.
My question is,
Sharon?
they only have to do this once, right? Or is it
Right.
every so many years?
It's just once.
So if a kindergarten parent wants to do it, it would cover them right through. It's only, people up the line. I would guess that would be a big deal. But I think the bigger deal is how far away it is.
We're looking for a vote. All those in favor of accepting the policy regarding fingerprinting?
Aye.
All those opposed? Unanimously passes. Thank you. Our subcommittee report, item 3, middle school repurposing.
So, since every other meeting, Sam's been here, I didn't be here tonight. Sam Hines was there was a meeting Wednesday night of the middle school repurposing. I didn't know about it until the last minute, so I didn't get there for the first half hour or so. And I got there at least halfway through Sam's presentation which was, from what I could tell, a very nice presentation on what the needs were for the elementary school to the very brand new, none of the members of the middle school repurposing are members that were there prior. And I couldn't tell you who they all are, but they're all men. And one of them happens to be Rick Gifford, guidance counselor at the high school. So from what I could tell, Sam was saying, that we needed more parking and we needed this